What if the power grid collapsed today? Are you prepared to face the chaos, the darkness, the total breakdown of society? Today, we reveal the 20 worst states to be in when the power grid goes down. Could your state be on the list? Imagine being trapped in a state where the infrastructure crumbles without power, where survival becomes a desperate struggle. States with harsh climates, dense populations, and poor emergency preparedness could turn into nightmares. The collapse of the power grid isn't just a possibility, it's a looming threat that could strike at any moment. Will you be stuck in sweltering heat without air conditioning, or freezing temperatures without heating? How will you find food, water, or even communicate with the outside world? Some states are ticking time bombs, ready to explode into chaos with just one catastrophic event. 20. Nevada. All right, folks, let's talk about Nevada. This state is known for its glittering Las Vegas lights and vast deserts, but when the power grid collapses, it's a whole different story. Nevada's population sits around 3.1 million people, with over 75% living in the Las Vegas metropolitan area. This high population density in one area spells trouble during a grid collapse. Crime rates in Vegas are already concerning, with violent crimes at about 6.9 per 1,000 residents. Imagine what happens when the lights go out and law enforcement is stretched thin. Nevada's arid climate poses another major issue. The state gets less than 10 inches of rainfall annually. Without power, water pumps fail. And with no natural water sources, dehydration becomes a real and deadly threat. Agriculture here is minimal, meaning food shortages would hit hard and fast. Supply chains would be disrupted, and with the state's heavy reliance on imports, residents could find themselves without access to essential goods almost immediately. 19. Alaska. Now, Alaska might seem like the ultimate survivalist paradise, but think again. With a population of around 730,000 spread out over an immense area, you might think it's the perfect place to avoid chaos, but the isolation works against it. In a power grid collapse, Alaska's major challenge is its remoteness. Supplies of food, fuel, and other necessities are heavily dependent on shipments from the lower 48 states. When these shipments stop, survival becomes a struggle. The state's extreme weather is another critical factor. Winter temperatures can drop below -30 degrees Fahrenheit, and without power, heating becomes impossible for most residents. This could lead to a surge in hypothermia cases. Additionally, Alaska's earthquake activity could further disrupt any efforts to restore power, making it a less than ideal location during a grid collapse. 18. California. California, the Golden State, home to nearly 40 million people, is a ticking time bomb when it comes to a power grid collapse. The state's aging infrastructure is frequently strained by natural disasters like wildfires and earthquakes. Just look at the 2020 wildfires that led to rolling blackouts affecting millions. High population density in cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco means chaos would spread quickly. Crime rates in these urban areas are already high, and a blackout would only make things worse. California's economy, though robust, is heavily reliant on a functioning power grid. The state's strict environmental regulations also limit the use of backup power sources, like diesel generators. When the grid goes down, everything from water distribution to healthcare systems is jeopardized. Add to that the risk of looting and civil unrest, and California becomes a nightmare scenario during a power outage. 17. Florida. Florida, the Sunshine State, might be a retiree's dream, but during a power grid collapse, it turns into a nightmare. With a population of over 21 million, many of whom are elderly, the vulnerability is high. Florida's crime rate is above the national average, and areas like Miami and Orlando would see a spike in lawlessness when the power goes out. The state's biggest threat comes from its weather. Florida is no stranger to hurricanes, which already cause widespread power outages. Without the grid, the aftermath of such storms would be catastrophic. Water supply systems would fail, leading to a lack of drinking water. Food supply chains would break down, leaving millions without access to necessities. The hot, humid climate would also become unbearable without air conditioning, leading to health crises among the elderly and young children. 16. Hawaii. Hawaii might be paradise on a good day, But in a grid collapse, it's an isolated disaster waiting to happen. With its population of 1.4 million spread across islands, Hawaii's biggest issue is its dependency on imports. Almost everything, from food to fuel, is shipped in. When the power goes out, so does the ability to distribute these essential supplies. The tropical climate, while beautiful, can become a breeding ground for diseases when sanitation systems fail due to power loss. Additionally, Hawaii's strategic military importance makes it a potential target in geopolitical conflicts, which could exacerbate any grid failure situation. The island's isolation means that aid and recovery efforts would be slower compared to the mainland, making survival more challenging. 15. Louisiana. Louisiana, with its rich culture and history, faces unique challenges during a power grid collapse. The state has around 4.6 million residents, many of whom live in low-lying areas prone to flooding. The crime rate here is significantly higher than the national average, with New Orleans being particularly notorious. In a blackout, these crime rates would likely skyrocket. Hurricanes are a frequent threat, and the state's power grid is not robust enough to handle such natural disasters. During Hurricane Ida in 2021, nearly 1 million people were left without power, some for weeks. This kind of scenario would become commonplace in a grid collapse, leaving residents without basic necessities. The hot, humid climate would worsen living conditions, and without refrigeration, food supplies would spoil quickly, leading to shortages and health crises. 14. New York. The Empire State, home to over 19 million people, is a powder keg in a grid collapse. New York City alone houses over 8 million residents, making it one of the most densely populated areas in the country. High population density combined with high crime rates, particularly in NYC, spells disaster when the power goes out. The subway system, relied upon by millions, would come to a halt, trapping people and causing mass panic. New York's economy, heavily dependent on financial markets, would take a massive hit. The high cost of living and reliance on electronic transactions mean that without power, day-to-day life grinds to a halt. Additionally, harsh winters would make survival difficult without heating, leading to a rise in hypothermia cases. Water distribution systems, already aging and overburdened, would fail, making access to clean water a major issue. 13. Illinois. Illinois, particularly Chicago, faces significant risks during a power grid collapse. The state has a population of about 12.7 million, with over 2.7 million in Chicago alone. The city's high crime rate, especially violent crimes, would spike further during a blackout. Chicago's murder rate is already one of the highest in the country, and without power, law enforcement would be overwhelmed. Illinois experiences harsh winters, and without power, heating systems would fail, leading to numerous cold-related illnesses and deaths. The state's infrastructure is also aging and not well prepared for a large-scale grid failure. Illinois' reliance on agriculture and food production means that any disruption in power would affect food supply chains, leading to shortages and panic. 12. Oregon. Oregon's beautiful landscapes hide a significant vulnerability in its power grid. With a population of around 4.2 million, Oregon's reliance on the Western interconnection makes it susceptible to wider grid issues affecting the West Coast. The state's power lines are primarily above ground, making them vulnerable to weather events like wildfires and ice storms, which have become more frequent and severe. Portland, the largest city, has seen a rise in crime rates, and a power grid collapse would exacerbate these issues. Additionally, recent reports of physical attacks on power infrastructure by extremist groups highlight a growing risk. The state's varied climate, from wet coastal regions to arid deserts, would pose different survival challenges, from flooding to water shortages. 11. Michigan. Michigan, with its harsh winters and high crime rates in cities like Detroit, is another state where you don't want to be during a power grid collapse. Michigan's population is around 10 million, with a significant portion living in urban areas. Detroit, in particular, has one of the highest crime rates in the nation. A power outage would likely lead to increased violence and looting. Winter temperatures in Michigan can drop to deadly levels, and without power, heating systems would fail, leading to hypothermia and frostbite. Michigan's economy, heavily reliant on manufacturing, would grind to a halt without power, causing widespread unemployment and economic turmoil. Water systems, particularly in Flint, are already problematic, and a grid collapse would exacerbate these issues, making clean water scarce. 10. Texas. Everything's bigger in Texas, including the problems during a power grid collapse. With a population of around 29 million, Texas operates on its own independent grid, ERCOT. While this independence can be a strength, it also means that Texas cannot easily draw power from neighboring states in an emergency. The 2021 winter storm Uri highlighted the vulnerabilities in Texas's power infrastructure, leaving millions without power and water. The state's extreme weather, from scorching summers to unexpected winter freezes, puts enormous strain on the grid. Major cities like Houston, Dallas, and Austin would face significant challenges, including high crime rates and logistical nightmares. Additionally, Texas's significant energy production infrastructure, while a strength in normal times, becomes a potential target during a collapse, making the state less safe. 9. New Jersey. New Jersey, with its high population density and urban sprawl, is another state to avoid during a power grid collapse. The state has around 9.3 million residents packed into a small area, making it the most densely populated state in the U.S. Cities like Newark and Jersey City have high crime rates, and a blackout would likely lead to a surge in violence and looting. New Jersey's reliance on external food and fuel supplies would become a significant problem when the power goes out. The state's infrastructure, particularly in older cities, is not well equipped to handle long-term power outages. Additionally, New Jersey's winters can be harsh, and without power, residents would struggle to stay warm and safe. The proximity to New York City also means that any problems in the neighboring state would spill over, exacerbating the situation in New Jersey. 8. Arizona. Arizona's scorching desert climate makes it one of the worst places to be during a power grid collapse. The state has a population of about 7.3 million, with over 1.7 million people living in Phoenix, its largest city. The high population density in urban areas like Phoenix and Tucson would lead to significant challenges. Crime rates in these cities are already relatively high, with Phoenix experiencing about 7.4 violent crimes per 1,000 residents. When the grid goes down, law enforcement would be overwhelmed, leading to a potential spike in crime and violence. Arizona's extreme heat poses a deadly threat. Without air conditioning, residents could face severe dehydration and heat stroke, especially during the summer months when temperatures often soar above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Water scarcity is another major issue. Arizona relies heavily on the Colorado River for its water supply, and without power, the infrastructure required to pump and distribute this water would fail. This would lead to a critical shortage of drinking water and impact agriculture, which is a significant part of the state's economy. The state's dependency on imported goods for food and other necessities would also be a problem. Supply chains would be disrupted, leading to food shortages and increasing the risk of social unrest. Moreover, Arizona's power grid is part of the Western interconnection, making it vulnerable to broader regional issues that could exacerbate the situation. All right, folks, buckle up because we're diving into the top 7 worst states to be in when the power grid collapses. From extreme weather to high crime rates, these states will be a nightmare when the lights go out. 7. Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, with a population of around 12.8 million, is a state that faces significant challenges in a power grid collapse. Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, the two largest cities, are home to nearly 2 million people combined. These urban centers already struggle with high crime rates. Philadelphia, for example, has a violent crime rate of about 11.6 per 1,000 residents. A power outage would likely lead to a surge in criminal activity, overwhelming law enforcement. The state's aging infrastructure and reliance on coal and nuclear power make it vulnerable to grid failures. Winters in Pennsylvania can be harsh, with temperatures often dropping below freezing. Without power, heating systems would fail, leading to a rise in hypothermia cases, particularly among the elderly and low-income residents. Additionally, the state's rural areas would face challenges in accessing essential services and supplies. Pennsylvania's diverse terrain, ranging from mountains to urban sprawl, means that natural disasters like snowstorms and flooding can further complicate recovery efforts. The state's significant industrial base, especially in manufacturing and energy production, would grind to a halt, causing economic turmoil and supply chain disruptions. 6. Ohio. Ohio, with its 11.7 million residents, is another state that would be severely affected by a power grid collapse. Major cities like Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati are densely populated, and high crime rates in these areas would likely spike during a blackout. Cleveland, for instance, has a violent crime rate of around 14.5 per 1,000 residents, and without power, law enforcement would be stretched thin. Ohio's economy relies heavily on manufacturing and agriculture, both of which would suffer immensely without power. Winter temperatures in Ohio can be brutal, often dipping into the single digits. The lack of heating would pose a serious risk to residents, especially those in older, poorly insulated homes. The state's infrastructure, particularly in older cities, is not well prepared for prolonged power outages. Ohio also faces a significant risk of natural disasters like tornadoes and severe storms, which can exacerbate the impact of a grid collapse. The state's dependency on coal-fired power plants adds another layer of vulnerability, as these plants are not easily restarted once they go offline. 5. Georgia. Georgia, with a population of about 10.8 million, is a state where a power grid collapse would be catastrophic. Atlanta, the state's largest city, is home to nearly 500,000 people and has a violent crime rate of 7.7 per 1,000 residents. During a blackout, crime rates would likely increase, and the densely populated urban areas would become hotspots for looting and violence. The state's hot, humid climate poses a significant health risk during a power outage. Without air conditioning, heat-related illnesses would become widespread, particularly among the elderly and young children. Georgia's reliance on agriculture means that any disruption in the power supply would have a devastating impact on food production and distribution. The state's infrastructure is not equipped to handle prolonged power outages. Natural disasters like hurricanes and severe thunderstorms are common in Georgia, and these events can further complicate recovery efforts. Additionally, Georgia's dependence on a mix of nuclear, coal, and natural gas power plants makes the grid more vulnerable to disruptions. 4. North Carolina. North Carolina, home to about 10.7 million people, faces significant challenges during a power grid collapse. Major cities like Charlotte and Raleigh have high population densities and elevated crime rates. Charlotte's violent crime rate stands at around 7.4 per 1,000 residents, and a blackout would likely lead to an increase in criminal activity. The state's varied climate includes hot, humid summers and cold winters, both of which pose risks during a power outage. Without air conditioning, residents would face heat stroke and dehydration during the summer, while the lack of heating in winter could lead to hypothermia. North Carolina's economy, heavily reliant on manufacturing and agriculture, would suffer immensely without power. Natural disasters like hurricanes and ice storms are common in North Carolina and can disrupt power restoration efforts. The state's infrastructure, especially in rural areas, is not well equipped to handle prolonged outages. The dependency on nuclear and coal-fired power plants adds another layer of vulnerability. 3. Tennessee. Tennessee, with a population of around 7 million, is a state where a power grid collapse would lead to widespread chaos. Nashville and Memphis, the two largest cities, are home to over 1.5 million people combined. Memphis, in particular, has a violent crime rate of about 19.5 per 1,000 residents, one of the highest in the country. A power outage would likely lead to a surge in criminal activity, overwhelming law enforcement. The state's hot, humid climate poses significant health risks during a power outage. Without air conditioning, residents would face heat-related illnesses, especially during the summer months. Tennessee's economy relies heavily on manufacturing and agriculture, both of which would be severely impacted by a power grid collapse. Tennessee also faces the risk of natural disasters like tornadoes and severe storms, which can disrupt power restoration efforts. The state's infrastructure is aging and not well prepared for prolonged outages. Additionally, Tennessee's reliance on a mix of coal, natural gas, and nuclear power plants makes the grid more vulnerable to disruptions. 2. Missouri. Missouri, with its population of around 6.1 million, would face significant challenges during a power grid collapse. St. Louis and Kansas City, the two largest cities, have high population densities and elevated crime rates. St. Louis, for example, has a violent crime rate of about 18.2 per 1,000 residents, and a blackout would likely lead to an increase in criminal activity. The state's varied climate includes hot, humid summers and cold winters, both of which pose risks during a power outage. Without air conditioning, residents would face heat stroke and dehydration during the summer, while the lack of heating in winter could lead to hypothermia. Missouri's economy, heavily reliant on manufacturing and agriculture, would suffer immensely without power. Natural disasters like tornadoes and severe storms are common in Missouri and can disrupt power restoration efforts. The state's infrastructure, especially in rural areas, is not well equipped to handle prolonged outages. The dependency on coal-fired power plants adds another layer of vulnerability. And finally, folks, Louisiana tops the list as the worst state to be in during a power grid collapse. With a population of around 4.6 million, many of whom live in low-lying, flood-prone areas, Louisiana faces unique challenges. New Orleans, with a violent crime rate of about 11.8 per 1,000 residents, would see a spike in lawlessness during a blackout. Louisiana's hot, humid climate poses significant health risks without power. The lack of air conditioning would lead to heat-related illnesses, particularly among the elderly and young children. The state's frequent hurricanes already cause widespread power outages, and a grid collapse would exacerbate these issues, leaving residents without access to clean water and essential supplies. The state's infrastructure is not robust enough to handle prolonged power outages, especially in the wake of natural disasters. Louisiana's reliance on a mix of oil, natural gas, and petrochemical industries means that any disruption in power would have a severe economic impact. The state's vulnerability to flooding, coupled with high crime rates and extreme weather, makes it the worst place to be during a power grid collapse. Thank you for watching.